The music in the long gallery at Wexcombe Hall reached every corner of the room except the one where the man stood, and that was the corner the whole season had agreed to forget. He was tall and unmoving by the cold of the terrace doors, a dark coat among brighter ones, and the orchestra meant nothing to him at all. A girl near the punch table laughed behind her fan, and said, loud because she believed it safe, that there was no use curtsying to the Duke of Aldmere, since he would not hear a single word she said. And what was the good of a husband who could not be charmed? The room laughed with her in the soft, practiced way a room laughs at the deficient. And Eleanor Hartley, standing at the edge of all of it, in a gown that had been turned twice and pressed too thin, watched his eyes move once briefly to the laughing girl's mouth, and then away, and she understood in that small motion that he had read every word. No one else had seen it. That was the thing she would carry from this night. The room believed him sealed inside silence the way a portrait is sealed, behind glass, decorative and deaf and conveniently unable to judge them. They spoke in front of him as though he were furniture. And he had let them, for years, because a man who is presumed to understand nothing is told a great many things he was never meant to hear. Stay with me through this one. By the end she will say a single sentence in a crowded room, and you will understand why he crossed it. For now, only this, the dismissed woman and the dismissed man, were the only two people at Wexcombe Hall paying attention. Eleanor had not been invited as a guest. She had come as a companion to old Lady Marbury, who was deaf herself in the ordinary way of age, and who had hired Eleanor in the spring for the simple reason that the girl spoke clearly, faced her when she spoke, and never once raised her voice as though volume were the same as kindness. Lady Marbury had been a beauty in another century, and was now a sharp, tired woman who needed an arm to the carriage, and a steady set of lips to follow. Eleanor gave her both. It was not the life Eleanor had been raised to expect. 2 years earlier she had been the elder daughter of a country gentleman with a comfortable house and a pianoforte she loved, and then her father had died with more debts than anyone had guessed, and the comfortable house had gone to a cousin, and the pianoforte had been sold to a family in the next county who did not play it. She had learned in the space of one winter exactly how quickly a woman becomes invisible when she stops being an heiress. The wound was not the poverty. The wound was a sentence her aunt had spoken across a breakfast table while Eleanor sat 3 feet away, a sentence delivered to a visiting friend as though Eleanor were already gone. A pity about Eleanor, her aunt had said. She had a face and a little music and nothing else, and now not even the music. The aunt had not lowered her voice. She had simply assumed that a girl with no fortune was a girl with no feelings worth the trouble of sparing. Eleanor had sat very still, and buttered bread she did not eat, and something in her had decided, quietly, that she would rather be unseen than be pitied aloud. She had been practicing invisibility ever since she was good at it, which was why it unsettled her so to be seen now, by a man across a gallery in the one fluent thing she had left. The Duke of Aldmere had inherited his title at 20, and his silence at 19, in that order, though the season liked to reverse them and pretend the silence had always been there. A fever the year before his father's death had taken most of his hearing, and then, slowly, the rest. He had spent the years since learning to live inside a world that assumed his mind had gone quiet, along with his ears. He read lips with a precision that frightened the few who realized he could. He watched hands and shoulders and the small betrayals of a jaw. He had built out of necessity the most attentive eyes in any room he entered, and he used them the way other men used hearing, and the result was that he knew more about the people around him than they would ever have allowed had they understood. He was 31 years old. He had not danced in 11 years. That night Lady Marbury wished to leave early, and Eleanor went to find the footman, and the shortest path ran along the terrace doors where the Duke stood apart. She did not mean to speak to him. She meant only to pass. A draught from the open door, though, had set Lady Marbury's shawl slipping from Eleanor's arm, and as she caught it, she looked up and found him already looking at her. And the ordinary thing, the polite thing, the thing her body did before her caution could stop it, was to say good evening. She said it facing him, without thinking, because 2 months of facing Lady Marbury had trained her mouth to be readable. "Good evening, Your Grace." She did not raise her voice. She did not exaggerate. She simply let the words sit plainly on her lips the way she had learned to do for a woman who needed them. Plain. Something changed in his face. It was very slight. A man watching closely would have called it nothing. Eleanor had spent 2 years learning to read the smallest weather in a face, because the unseen learned to watch the seen. And she saw the precise moment that the Duke of Aldmere understood that she had spoken to him correctly. Not loudly. Not slowly, as one speaks to a child or an invalid. Correctly. As one speaks to a man one expects to be answered by. He inclined his head. "Good evening," he said, and his voice was low and a little roughened from disuse, the voice of a man who did not often trouble to use it. Then he glanced deliberately toward the punch table where the girl with the fan still stood, and back to Eleanor, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost, but not quite, permitted to be a smile. He had seen that she had seen. He knew that she knew the room had laughed at him, and he was telling her without a word that anyone else could catch that he had heard the laughter too. Eleanor curtsied and went to find the footman, and her face was warm the whole way down the corridor, and she told herself it was the closeness of the fire. She did not sleep well. She lay in the narrow room beside Lady Marbury's chamber and turned the small moment over and over. The way one turns a coin found in a coat, long out of use. He had answered her. More than that. He had shared something with her, a private joke at the expense of a cruel room, and the sharing had assumed she was clever enough to receive it. No one had assumed her clever in a long time. The hierarchy that had folded her up and put her away did not waste cleverness on companions. She was a useful pair of clear lips and a steady arm, and that was the whole of what the world required her to be. The following week brought the Marbury household to the country, to a house that bordered the Aldmere estate. And the season followed because the season followed wherever the great houses opened their doors. There were to be 3 weeks of dinners and a hunt the gentlemen cared about, and a ball at the end that the mothers cared about more. Lady Marbury, who found the country dull and the company duller, attended everything out of spite, and made Eleanor attend with her. And so Eleanor found herself again and again in rooms where the Duke of Aldmere stood apart, and the conversation flowed around him like water around a stone. She began to notice what the rooms did. At dinner he was seated, always at a distance from the talk. In the place a host gives a guest who cannot join in, and the talk traveled the length of the table without once turning toward him. Ladies addressed remarks to his neighbor, and let the neighbor relay them as though the Duke were a foreign country requiring a translator. The men spoke of him in the third person while he sat among them. And Eleanor, watching from her low place near Lady Marbury, saw what none of them saw, which was that his eyes moved constantly, gathering every word off every mouth at the table, and that he understood the whole conversation and chose out of long weariness to let them believe he did not. It was a kind of invisibility. She recognized they had each been put behind glass. She by poverty, he by silence. And from behind their separate panes they could see each other, with a clarity the bright, loud middle of the room would never have. The first time he sought her out, she did not believe it was deliberate. It was the second evening at the hall, and the company had moved to the music room, and a young lady was persuaded to the pianoforte, and Eleanor stood near the window where companions stand. The Duke came to the window too. He stood a careful, proper distance from her, looking out at the dark grounds, and then he turned his head so that she could see his mouth and said, "You play." It was not a question. She glanced at him, startled. "How could you know that?" "Your hands," he said. "When she plays, badly. Your fingers move on the sill. You are correcting her." Eleanor looked down and found that her gloved hand had indeed been pressing the windowsill in small motions, the ghost of fingering a passage the girl at the instrument kept fumbling. She had not known she was doing it. She had not known anyone was watching her hands. For 2 years she had been certain that no one watched her at all. "I had a pianoforte once," she said, before she could decide whether to be guarded. "It was sold." He did not say he was sorry. The people who said they were sorry were the ones who then changed the subject. He watched her mouth and waited, and the waiting was its own kind of attention. And so she found herself adding, "It went to a family who do not play it." That is the part I mind. Not that I lost it, that it sits closed in a house where no one opens it. A closed instrument in a silent house, he said. His voice was low. Yes, I know something of that. And there it was. The first deniable thing, the kind of remark a person could pretend was about furniture. Eleanor heard the second meaning in it the way she had been trained to hear second meanings, and her breath went strange in her chest, and she looked at him too long, and the young lady finished her piece, and the room applauded, and the moment closed like a door. That night she did not tell herself it was the fire. If you have ever been the quiet one in a loud room, you already know what was happening to her, even though she did not. Let her not know a little longer. It is sweeter that way. The thing that turned attention into something with weight happened 4 days later, and the Duke witnessed it, though Eleanor did not know he was there. It was morning, and the children of the house were her unofficial charges in the hours Lady Marbury slept, for the governess had taken ill and no one had troubled to replace her, and so a companion did the work, because a companion always does the work that falls between the cracks. There were 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, and the girl had been crying because an older cousin, a polished boy of 12 with a cruel idle streak, had told her that her drawing of a horse looked like a dog that had been stepped on, and the whole nursery party had laughed. And the little girl had folded the drawing into a tight square to hide it. Eleanor did not scold the cousin. She knelt on the nursery floor in her plain gown, and she unfolded the crumpled drawing with great care, smoothing it flat against the boards, and she looked at it for a long, honest moment, and then she said in a voice meant only for the child that she could see exactly what the horse was doing. It was lifting one foot, she said, the way horses do when they are about to walk. And that was a very difficult thing to draw, the lifted foot, because it meant the artist had truly looked at a horse and not merely imagined one. So many children drew horses standing flat and dead. This horse was alive. It was about to move. The little girl unfolded. Eleanor saw it happen, the way a closed thing opens. The child looked at her own drawing as though seeing it for the first time, and she asked in a whisper whether she might draw another. And Eleanor said she might draw 100, and that she would like to keep this first one if the girl could spare it, because she collected pictures of horses that were about to move. It was not true. She owned nothing. She could call a collection. The lie cost her nothing, and gave the child everything. And that, Eleanor had decided long ago, was the only kind of lie worth telling. She did not know that the Duke of Aldmere had come up to the nursery to see the children, as he did most mornings, quietly, because the children did not speak around him the way the adults did. They simply showed him things, and a man starved of being shown things will climb a great many stairs for it. He had stopped in the doorway. He had read every word off Eleanor's lips as she knelt on the floor and gave a frightened child her drawing back. And he had stood there, unseen by her, and understood that he was looking at the rarest thing he knew, which was a person being kind when she believed no one was counting. He did not come in. He went back down the stairs, and that afternoon a parcel arrived for the little girl, a box of good drawing pencils and a quire of proper paper with no card, and the household assumed it was from an aunt. Only Eleanor, who had been in the nursery and knew the size of the thing, wondered. She did not let herself finish the wondering. The distance between a duke and a companion was not a distance one wondered across. Without being made to pay for it, the dowager arrived the following week, and the weather of the whole party changed. The Dowager Duchess of Aldmere was the Duke's aunt by marriage, a woman of 70, who had run the family since his mother died, and who had decided long ago that her nephew's silence made him hers to manage. She had brought with her a young lady named Miss Beaumont, the daughter of a viscount, polished and pale and lovely in ice blue, who had been selected the way one selects a horse or a parcel of land as the correct future Duchess of Aldmere. The reasoning was sound by the hierarchy's own arithmetic. Miss Beaumont's fortune was large, and her family old and her manners faultless, and the dowager had observed more than once it hardly mattered whether the girl could converse with the duke, since the duke could not converse, and so the two of them might sit in handsome silence for 40 years and produce handsome silent heirs, and the estate would be served. Eleanor heard the dowager say almost exactly this at a dinner 3 places down, in a voice pitched to be overheard by everyone except the man it concerned. The dowager spoke in front of the duke as freely as anyone. Freer, because she believed his deafness was a convenience the family had been given. "My nephew requires a wife who will not expect to be entertained," she said to the table, smiling. "Miss Beaumont understands that a great house is not a conversation. She will decorate it beautifully." And the table murmured its approval, and Miss Beaumont lowered her eyes with practiced modesty. And the Duke of Aldmere cut his meat and read every syllable off his aunt's mouth, and did not change his face by a hair. Eleanor, watching, saw his hand. It had gone still on the knife. Just for a moment, the stillness of a man absorbing a blow he has been struck so often. He no longer flinches outwardly, only inwardly, only in the smallest places. And she felt, rising in her, something she had no right to feel on his behalf, a hot and useless anger, because she knew exactly what it was to be discussed in the third person while sitting in the room. The dowager noticed Eleanor's face. The dowager noticed everything that might require correcting. After dinner in the drawing-room, she summoned Eleanor with one finger and looked her over, the way one looks over a tradesman's bill, and she said pleasantly that she had observed the companion taking a great deal of interest in the family, and that a young woman in a dependent position would do well to remember that interest in her station was easily mistaken for ambition, and ambition in a girl with nothing was the most unbecoming thing in the world. She said it kindly. That was the worst of it. She said it the way one gives useful advice to a servant one means to keep. "A companion who forgets herself," the dowager said, "is a companion who is let go. You are, I think, a sensible girl. You have nothing. Sensible girls with nothing do not look at dukes." The label landed exactly where the dowager aimed it. A girl with nothing. Eleanor curtsied and said she understood. And she did understand, and the understanding sat in her like a stone for the rest of the evening. She had let herself for a few foolish days feel almost visible. The dowager had simply reminded her of the glass. What the dowager did not know, because she had never once imagined the duke could follow a conversation she held quietly at the far side of a drawing-room, was that her nephew had read the whole of it off her lips from across the candle-lit space. He had watched his aunt back the companion into a corner and call her a girl with nothing, and a girl with ambition in the same breath. He had seen Eleanor's face hold steady through it. And that night, for the first time in 11 years, the Duke of Aldmere lay awake, not from the silence, but from a fury he did not entirely understand, and the last thing he saw before he slept was a woman kneeling on a nursery floor unfolding a child's crumpled drawing as though it were a thing of value. He began to find reasons. A duke can always find reasons. He asked Lady Marbury to dine, which delighted her, and seated her companion where the companion could be seen. He took to the morning nursery hour openly now, and Eleanor, who could not in courtesy leave a room, a duke entered, stayed, and they fell into the habit of speaking by the window, while the children drew. He learned that she had loved Bach and hated needlework, and once walked 4 miles in the rain to return a borrowed book a day early, because she could not bear to be thought careless with another person's things. She learned that he had taught himself to read 3 languages off the page in the years he could no longer hear them spoken, that he found music in the vibration of a great instrument through the floor, and missed it more than he would say, and that the children of his house were the only people who had never once spoken to him slowly. "You speak to me as you would to anyone," he told her one morning. "Why?" "Because you understand as well as anyone," she said. "Better than most. It would be an insult to do otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. "No one else has decided that," he said. "They have not troubled to look," she answered. "It is easier to decide a thing is empty than to find out what is in it." His jaw moved. She had said too much. She thought she had said the thing that was true about him and also true about herself, and the room had grown very warm, and she was aware of exactly where he stood without looking at him, aware of it in her skin, the way one is aware of a fire across a room. She made herself look at the children. Her hand had found the windowsill again. She did not let her fingers move. "Come and walk," he said. It was not a request. "The children may walk with us. The dog needs the grounds." It was a command, plain and level, the kind of thing his rank let him say. And Eleanor understood, even as she gathered the children, that the command was a courtesy in disguise, that he had ordered the walk so that she could accept it without choosing it, so that no one could say the companion had presumed. He had built her a door she could walk through without being blamed for opening it. She went. The morning was gold and cold, and the dog ran ahead, and the children gathered conkers, and the Duke of Aldmere walked beside a companion, at a perfectly proper distance, and watched her mouth when she spoke, as though her words were the only sound in a world he had been told, held no sound for him at all. That was the autumn the season talked about later, though it told the story wrong. It said the Duke had been entrapped. It said the companion had been clever. The season was never able to imagine that two people behind glass had simply, finally been seen by someone who knew how to look. The Dowager moved to end it with the efficiency of a woman who has ended things before. She did not rage. Rage was for people without power. She arranged. She let it be known, in the soft channels by which such things are let known, that the Duke of Aldmere's engagement to Miss Beaumont would be announced at the closing ball, and she arranged for the announcement to be printed before it was true, so that the truth would have to bend to meet the print. She informed her nephew of the arrangement by letter, in writing, because she had discovered long ago that her nephew could not argue with a letter as he might argue with a face, and she believed, wrongly, that a thing put in writing to a deaf man was a thing decided. And she dealt with the companion directly. She came to Lady Marbury's borrowed house, and she sat in the small drawing-room, and she told Eleanor that her employment with Lady Marbury would conclude at the end of the month, that a position had been found for her in the north, in the household of a clergyman with 6 children and a small stipend, and that the carriage would come for her on the morning after the ball. She had spoken to Lady Marbury, who was old and tired, and not inclined to fight a duchess over a companion she could replace. It was arranged. It was kind. The Dowager said the position was respectable. A girl with nothing could not expect respectable forever. There it was again, the third time in a third room. A girl with nothing. The label had followed Eleanor from the gallery to the dinner table to this small, cold parlor. And each time it had been spoken by someone certain of the right to speak it, and each time Eleanor had said she understood. She said it now. She understood. She would be ready for the carriage. "You will attend the ball, though," the Dowager added, rising, drawing on her gloves. "Lady Marbury wishes it, and it would cause comment if her companion were absent. You will attend, and you will be pleasant, and you will say nothing to anyone. And the day after, you will be gone. And all of this will have been a small autumn folly, that no one remembers by Christmas. Do you understand me, Miss Hartley?" "I understand you, Your Grace," Eleanor said. And she did. The dark days before the ball were the worst Eleanor had known since the winter her father died, and they were quiet, because she had no one to tell. She packed in the evenings. She folded the 2 gowns and the turned shawl and the small box that held everything she owned of her old life. A ribbon, a letter in her father's hand, and a single key to a pianoforte in a house in another county. A key she had kept for no reason, except that it was the last thing she had touched, that her own hands had owned freely. She had nearly thrown it away a dozen times. She never had. She told herself she had imagined the whole of it. A duke does not choose a companion. The walk in the gold morning had been kindness, and kindness was not the same as choice, and she had let her starved heart make a banquet of crumbs. The Dowager was right. She had forgotten herself. She would go north and teach her clergyman's 6 children their letters, and grow into a useful, sharp old woman like Lady Marbury. And that was not the worst fate the world handed out, and she would not weep over a man who had never once said a word to make her think he meant anything at all. Except that he had said, "Yes, I know something of that." He had said, "No one else has decided that." He had built her a door out of a command so she could walk through it unblamed. The body knows what the mind forbids it to say, and Eleanor's body had known for weeks exactly where the Duke of Aldmere stood in any room she entered, and no amount of folding gowns could pack that knowledge away. She did not know that the Duke had received his aunt's letter and read it twice and set it down with a calm that would have frightened the Dowager had she seen it. She did not know that he had spent 2 days with his solicitor, a dry, careful man named Mr. Pierce, who had served the family 30 years and who had never been spoken to slowly by the Duke in his life. She did not know that he had asked Mr. Pierce a single question, which was whether a man of sound mind and full estate could marry exactly whom he chose, regardless of any announcement his aunt had caused to be printed. And that Mr. Blacks, Pierce had said, with the faint pleasure of a man asked at last to be useful, that he could, that the printing of a thing did not make it law, and that he, Pierce, would be glad to attend the ball to say so to anyone who required saying to. The closing ball at Wexcombe Hall filled the long gallery where the season had begun. The same gallery, the same orchestra, the same bright crowd, the same cold terrace doors. Eleanor came in Lady Marbury's wake in her twice-turned gown and took her place at the edge where companions stand, and she had decided to be a stone, to feel nothing, to pass through the evening invisible and be gone by morning. She watched the Dowager hold court near the great fireplace, with Miss Beaumont arranged at her side in ice blue, the announcement ready, the room primed. She watched the Duke of Aldmere stand apart by the terrace doors exactly where he had stood the first night, a dark coat among brighter ones, and she did not let herself look at his mouth. The Dowager judged the moment and rose. She tapped a glass, and the orchestra trailed off, and the room turned its bright attention to her, and she began to speak of the joy it gave the family to announce a union long hoped for. And she turned graciously toward her nephew, the twant intending to draw him into the light beside Miss Beaumont, and seal the thing in front of 300 witnesses, before he could do anything a deaf man was thought incapable of doing. The Duke of Aldmere, though, was already moving. He crossed the gallery. He did not hurry. He crossed it the way weather crosses a valley, without consultation, and the crowd parted because a duke crossing a room makes the room into a corridor, and the Dowager's practiced sentence faltered on her lips because her nephew was not walking toward Miss Beaumont. He was walking toward the edge of the room. He was walking toward the place where companions stand. He stopped in front of Eleanor Hartley, in front of all of them, and the whole gallery held its breath in a silence that for once included him. Because for the first time in 11 years, the quietest man in the room had made the room as quiet as himself. He looked at Eleanor, he let the room wait. And then in his low, roughened voice, pitched so that every mouth in that gallery could be read by every eye, he said the thing he had crossed the room to say. "Marry me." "I have heard you perfectly." The line landed in the silence the way a single bell lands in a still morning. 5 words. Eleanor's hand rose to her own mouth. She did not speak. She could not. The room did not breathe. It was the Dowager who broke her glass, came down hard on the mantel, and her voice, when it came, had lost its polish and found a higher cracked register that the room had never heard from her. "He cannot," she said, "to no one, to everyone. He does not understand what is being said to him. He never has. This girl has. She has." And the sentence would not finish, because there was no end to it that did not require admitting that her nephew had understood everything she had said for 30 years, every cruelty, every arrangement, every word spoken in front of him as though he were furniture. And the admitting of it emptied the air from her like a hand from a glove. Mr. Pierce stepped forward from near the doors, dry and calm, and said to the gentleman nearest the Dowager that as the family's solicitor, he was glad to confirm his grace was of full and sound mind and complete authority over his own person and estate, and that no announcement, printed or spoken, bound him to any engagement he had not himself made, and that he would be pleased to put it in writing for any party who wished it. The gentleman murmured. The procedural door clicked, shut, Miss Beaumont, who was not a cruel girl, but only a managed one, looked at the dowager, and then at the Duke, and then with a small flush of something that might have been relief, stepped back and away, and made herself part of the watching crowd, and the field was clear. In the season's correct future, Duchess removed herself from the field, without a single unkind word being needed. Eleanor found her voice. It came out low and steady and clear, the way she had trained it for 2 years. Plain on her lips, so that the man in front of her could read every word. "You should not," she said. "I am a girl with nothing. They will say I trapped you." The Duke of Aldmere, who had been called deaf, managed and pitied and decided about for 11 years by a room full of people who never thought to face him when they spoke, looked at the only person who had ever spoken to him as though he were entirely a man, and he answered her in the silence that her own clear lips had taught him she deserved. "You have nothing," he said. "So do I. We will keep it together." It was not poetry. It was better. The crowd, which had come for a printed engagement and an ice-blue future, found itself instead the witness to a thing it could not have arranged and did not wholly understand. And the strange truth of the moment moved through the gallery the way warmth moves through a cold house, room by room, until even the people who had laughed at him on the first night of the season were, without quite deciding to, glad. The dowager sat down in a chair that a footman had the wit to bring, and she did not rise again that evening, and in the weeks that followed, she would tell a version of the story, in which she had always known her nephew was the cleverest man in England, and no one would correct her, because the moral weather of that gallery had already shifted past her, and there was no profit in cruelty to a woman who had lost the one thing she had been certain of. Eleanor put her hand in his. It was the first time they had touched without the excuse of a shawl or a child or a careful proper distance, and his hand closed over hers, warm and certain, and she felt the whole 11 years of his held stillness ease, by a fraction through his fingers, and she understood that she had given him something too, that a man who has been treated as silence for half his life had just been answered out loud in front of everyone by a woman who had never once raised her voice to do it. They did not announce anything further that night. They did not need to. The room had seen. The wedding was small by the standards of a duke, and it was held in the spring at the parish church near the Aldmere estate, with the 2 children of the house scattering early bluebells down the aisle, the little girl in front, walking carefully, holding a drawing she had made of a horse lifting 1 foot to walk. Lady Marbury attended in her best, sharp and pleased, and took credit, loudly, for having hired the right companion, and was allowed to. Mr. Pierce attended and wept dryly once, and pretended it was the cold. The dowager attended too, smaller now, and was seated with honor, because Eleanor had insisted on it, and when Eleanor passed her in the churchyard, the new Duchess of Aldmere paused and faced her, and said good morning, plainly and kindly, the way one speaks to a person one means to be understood by, and the dowager after a moment set it back. By the following winter the great house was not silent. Eleanor had a pianoforte again, a new one, a gift, but that was not the instrument the story closed on. On a cold, bright evening in December, with snow beginning at the long windows and the children asleep upstairs, and the fire steady in the grate, Eleanor went to the small writing desk in the morning room, where she kept the few things she had carried out of her old life, and she took out the single key she had never been able to throw away. The key to a closed pianoforte in a house in another county where no one played. Her husband watched her from across the room. He always watched her now openly the way other men listened, and she had stopped finding it strange and started finding it the warmest fact of her days. She turned the key over in her fingers, and then she crossed the room and put it into his hand and faced him so he could read her, and she said that she had decided what to do with it. She was going to write to the family who had bought her father's pianoforte, and she was going to ask if she might pay to have it tuned, on the condition that they promised to open it sometimes and let a child learn on it, because a closed instrument in a silent house was the saddest thing she knew. And she did not want any house to hold one if she could help it. He read every word off her lips in the firelight. Then he closed his hand around the key and around her hand, and he did not say anything, because some things did not require the voice he so rarely used, and the snow came down past the tall windows onto the grounds that were hers now. And somewhere above them 2 children slept who had never once been spoken to slowly. In a house that had learned, at last, how to be heard. Thank you for staying to the end of our story. If a quiet moment in it found you, I am glad you were here to be found,